Imagine the place where you feel most safe. Now let me share the story of Adam, whose safest place is probably somewhere quite different than what you just had in mind. 2 years ago, I met Adam. Adam had crooked teeth. Some were missing. His nose looked like it had been broken many times. He had tattoos on his face. Adam never met his biological mom or dad. His adoptive parents told him that he had been left in an alley after birth and soon got adopted. His adoptive parents provided him shelter, but not a home. They were embarrassed to be seen with an indigenous kid, so when family friends came over, Adam was sent to the basement. When his adoptive parents went to church, Adam had to stay home, supposedly to babysit the family's dog. Adam's adoptive dad and his neighbor physically and sexually abused him many, many times. When he finally confided in his adoptive mom, she kicked him out. She did not want to, as she put it, live with a faggot in her home. Adam was 9 at the time. He wandered the streets until he was brought to social services. From there, he was passed from one foster home to the next. When I asked him what he remembers about the foster homes, he told me about alcohol, drugs, beatings, and sexual violence. Birthdays and Christmas were not celebrated. Adam has never had a playdate in his life. In total, Adam was in 17 foster homes. Adam started breaking into cars and homes when he was a teenager. He got involved in fights, but most often he got beat up. Sometimes he even got into fights with police and prison guards. He told me about one instance where he lost 2 of his teeth after a prison guard slammed his head and pushed him down a staircase. Despite this, Adam also told me that the place where we were meeting was the safest place he had ever lived. We were in prison. Adam was a prisoner. With my team of researchers, I have spent the last 3 years talking to over 800 men and women who are housed in provincial and federal prisons, both those who are remanded, which means they are waiting for their trial and are not sentenced, and those who are already sentenced. This is by far the largest interview-based study that has ever been conducted on Canadian prisons and quite possibly in the world. Some of the people who volunteered to speak with us were in prison because they had accumulated too many fines they could not afford to pay. Many were in prison because they had committed some drug-related offenses. Some were gang members, some sex offenders, and some were murderers. In other words, we talked to everyone. Those incarcerated for a short time and those who were sentenced to life. People on minimum security and on maximum security units, in general population units, and on solitary confinement. Adam was not unique among the people we met in prison. 95% of all the men we talked to and 97% of all the women we talked to in the federal system had been physically or sexually victimized long before they have ever been charged with a crime. 95% of the men, 97% of the women. It is worth emphasizing this finding because too often the criminal justice system, but also society at large, thinks of people in prison as just offenders. That is, people who have committed crime and deserve punishment. More often than not, however, those who are housed in our prisons are themselves victims, and were for a long time before ever being convicted of a crime. As criminologists, we call this the victim-offender overlap. The great majority of our participants, however, have never reported their victimization to police. Those who did report often told us that police, social workers, or family and child welfare services did not believe them or did not care. Many of our participants moved through multiple foster homes and caregiver situations. The great majority of them were introduced to drugs at some point in their lives, often using in order to deal with and numb the trauma experienced throughout their childhood and teenager years. Many lived on the streets, on and off. As they told us about their life stories, they did not use these experiences as excuses for the crimes they have committed. In fact, I remember talking to Sean, a big, muscular gang member who told me his earliest memories were of his dad beating him up with a broom when he was sitting in a high chair as a toddler, and another situation where he pushed him through a glass window and Sean's face got all cut up when he was just 4. He said, "I don't want your sympathy. It made me a tough motherfucker. I've had to live with it my whole life, so it's just kind of normal, right?" Perhaps surprisingly, of the more than 800 people in our study, we have not met one single person who tried to use their own life experiences as an excuse for their criminal activity. In stark contrast, they generally told us, "I did the crime, I'll do the time." It became clear that their often traumatic and horrific circumstances seemed normal to them. Before we started our project, we had expected to hear an overwhelming outpour of negative stories about prison. The academic literature on prisons, especially in Canada, is dominated by scholars who emphasize the pains of imprisonment, discuss human rights violations, talk about violence between guards and prisoners, and about many other inherently negative things. Many punishment scholars, both in Canada and abroad, argue that prisons should ultimately be abolished. It is also true that many scholars writing about punishments in prisons have spent little or no time actually conducting research inside these places. So this literature is dominated by theoretical ideas about how society should and should not punish, and assumes that people who are incarcerated think about their incarceration experiences only in negative terms. In contrast to these dominant representations of prison, it was far more common for our participants to tell us about how prison provides them with a space of temporary refuge. This was not true for all of the people we talked to. Some of the people we met in prison did mostly focus on the negative and often inhumane conditions. However, the great majority of the people we met in prison lived lives characterized by abusive relationships, addictions, and homelessness. For them, prison served as a place where they could potentially sleep relatively safely in a long time because shelters, as they told us, are not necessarily safe for them. It served as a place where they could escape their abusive partners, could finally get meals on a regular basis, or where they could take steps to get sober from the potentially lethal drugs they were using on the streets, with some using prison as a place to start a drug substitution program. Many found that the medical and dental attention they could get inside the prisons was more accessible for them than in their communities on the outside. Let me introduce you to Elizabeth. Elizabeth was another person I met in prison. She was an elderly woman and told me she had worked at a job in the same store for 25 years. Growing up, Elizabeth lived in 27 foster homes and in residential school. She has been physically and sexually abused throughout her entire life, having been assaulted by foster parents, foster siblings, residential school teachers, family friends, and her spouse. Twice, she told family and social welfare services about the abuse she experienced. Twice, she was dismissed. She committed a crime when she reached a breaking point, not being able to take the abuse from her spouse anymore. But as a first-time offender, her sentence was rather short, and she was nearing the end of it when we spoke. As we talked, Elizabeth had a hard time making eye contact with me. The only time she lit up was when I asked her whether she was looking forward to her upcoming release date. She looked me straight into my eyes and said, "I will punch a guard out to be able to stay longer." Elizabeth Elizabeth has nothing on the outside to look forward to. For her, prison may not be desirable, but Elizabeth was like so many of our participants who told us prison was better than the alternative. Now, I want to be crystal clear. I am not telling a story about prison as a good place. The living conditions in the prison we visited are hard and sometimes horrendous. We have been on units where 3 people have to sleep in a cell designed for 2, with one of them on the floor. The only decision you can make when sleeping on the floor is whether your head or your feet touch the toilet. There's no room to move around. On some units, people were locked up in those cells with no access to common areas, showers, phones, or simply room to move around for 23 hours a day. We heard about overdoses, heard about and witnessed violence, so I am not talking about prison as a pleasant place. What I am suggesting is that our participants' experiences point to the failures and limitations of Canada's often celebrated social welfare system. The stories we heard in prison represent the cumulative weight of structural violence in our participants' lives, and for our Indigenous participants, these represent the lingering effects of colonialism. The lived reality of many of our participants is one where, perversely, prison starts to look like a place of temporary refuge from otherwise intolerable, dangerous, and unhealthy situations. Elizabeth, Adam, Sean, and other prisoners speak about prison as a place of temporary refuge only because the other institutions in our society, such as schools, police, child welfare services, the court system, shelters, medical and counseling services, and a government that ultimately placed them in abusive foster homes or residential schools, have so dramatically failed them. Our participants are not adequately protected from predation. On the outside, they turn to drugs to numb their trauma because counseling, such as psychological or psychiatric services, are financially or pragmatically out of reach. They risk their lives performing sex for survival because they have no other financial means to support themselves. Adequate housing is so scarce that a subset actually turn to prison because the alternative is potentially freezing or going hungry on the streets. In essence, for a subset of Canadians living extremely marginal lives, prison provides an opportunity to connect, often for the first time, with the social and material benefits of our social safety net. What we need to ask ourselves is, what sort of society do we live in when these people say that the most comprehensive care they have ever received is found in prison? A place that is meant to be a last resort, a last stop, and not a first stop. There are too many Adams out there who have never talked to anyone about their traumas, often experienced in government care. Only very few of our participants have ever had long-term one-on-one counseling. The reality of incarceration in many prisons in Canada is to lock people away in a human warehouse without addressing any of the underlying issues that led to their incarceration. Considering a year in federal prison in Canada costs taxpayers about $115,000 per prisoner, these financial resources could be better used to address the underlying traumas that contributed to getting them into prison in the first place and potentially help them to not return. On average, our participants have been incarcerated 14 times, meaning they return over and again. Using these financial resources to address underlying traumas does not deny the fact that our participants have, later on in their lives, themselves inflicted harms on other people. How are deeply marginalized and traumatized people who have often experienced their traumas while in government care, in foster homes, in group homes, in church homes, supposed to cope with their traumatic histories and not reoffend when they receive little and sometimes no help to actually address those deeply traumatic experiences. Police, education, social services, and health institutions need to learn about the background stories of their clients, start recognizing trauma early, and actually get serious about supporting trauma services. Most importantly, as a society, we need to start concentrating on the underlying social conditions that constantly reproduce trauma among our most marginalized citizens. I am hopeful that some small change is on its way. We have seen our own data being used by the local police service to train new officers about who they will interact with on a daily basis. We have also been able to push for victim services in some remand centers. However, we still have a long way to go to become truly trauma-informed. Our findings show that until we find a way to address underlying social conditions that produce trauma, build communities that stop constantly reproducing trauma instead of putting people in cages in a human warehouse, and address some of the challenges faced by incarcerated people, looking at them as human beings, as victims, and not only as offenders, our participants may continue to tell us that prison is the safest place we have to offer for some of our most vulnerable citizens. And that is probably the biggest tragedy of our research findings.